The universe was wrong. Kaelin Valerius felt it in her bones. A deep, resonant hum of discordance that had been the background radiation of her entire life, of every human life for the last 700 years. It was in the way starlight seemed to bend incorrectly at the edge of perception, the way the ship's inertial dampeners fought against a subtle, unseen current, a cosmic drag that didn't exist in the old physics texts. This was the curse of the veil, the pocket dimension that had been their prison, their crucible, and their home. Her ship, the UNS Unmaking, was the culmination of that 700-year curse, a blade honed in a reality that was never meant to sustain life, designed for a single purpose to cut its way back into the one that was. On the bridge, there was no sound but the straining groan of the hull and the strained breathing of her crew. Every surface vibrated, energized by the impossible power being channeled through the ship's core. Before them, the main view screen showed nothing but a roiling, nauseating chaos of non-color and paradoxical geometry, the dimensional wall. They had been pushing against it for 37 standard hours. The ship's breaker engine, a marvel of gravitic engineering that bent space-time into a weapon, firing a sustained, focused lance of distorted reality at the barrier. Structural integrity is at 9%. Breaker. First Officer Janley's voice crackled, laced with the metallic strain of the ship's internal comms. The emitter array is starting to slag. We have one more cycle before catastrophic failure. Kaelin's gloved hands tightened on the command throne's arms. Her knuckles were white, her gaze fixed on the maelstrom. She could feel the breaker engine through the deck plates, a monstrous, caged god screaming for release. It was a testament to generations of physicists and engineers who had turned the aberrant laws of their prison into a key. In prime reality, the universe of their ancestors, such an engine would have torn a star system apart. Here, in the veil, it was barely enough to scratch the walls of their cage. One cycle is all we were ever going to get, Kaelin said, her voice a low, steady anchor in the chaos. Divert all non-essential power to the forward emitters. Everything. Life support, secondary lighting, nav systems. Give the engine all of it. A chorus of acknowledgments followed, the grim professionalism of a crew who had trained their entire lives for this singular, suicidal charge. The lights on the bridge dimmed, plunging them into a twilight lit only by the hellish glow of the view screen and the red of emergency monitors. The air grew thin, the recycled tang of ozone sharp in Kaelin's nostrils. The vibration intensified, a bone-jarring shudder that felt like the ship was being torn apart atom by atom. This was it. The final gamble. For centuries, the Soul Ascendancy had lived with the inherited memory of their betrayal, passed down through generations like a sacred, hateful text. They were the descendants of Earth, a species deemed too chaotic, too ambitious, too pathologically expansive by a coalition of ancient, self-appointed galactic shepherds known as the Architect's Covenant. The Covenant had not used bombs or fleets to solve their human problem. Their methods were more elegant, more absolute. They had not destroyed humanity. They had unplugged it from the universe, shunting the entire Sol system into this dimensional cul-de-sac, a cosmic oubliette from which there was supposed to be no escape. They had erased humanity not with a bang, but with a quiet, dismissive flick of godlike power. But they had made one catastrophic miscalculation. They assumed that what they had caged would wither and die. They never considered that it might learn to gnaw through the bars. Energy levels are spiking beyond maximum tolerance, Gian shouted, her console flashing a cascade of warnings. The core is going critical on the view screen. The chaotic wall of the veil began to tear. It started as a hairline fracture, a sliver of pure, clean black against the swirling madness. It was the most beautiful thing Kaylin had ever seen. "Hold it steady," she commanded, her voice barely a whisper. Just a little longer. The fracture widened, the ship groaning in protest as the breaker engine gave its last, desperate scream. A light, pure and white and utterly alien, spilled through the growing tear. It was the light of a different universe, of true stars burning in a true void. Then, with a final, deafening shriek of tearing metal and reality, the unmaking punched through. The transition was violent. For a terrifying second, the ship was in both realities at once, its structure screaming as two different sets of physical laws warred for dominance over its hull. Oi. Then they were through, propelled into the blackness like a bullet fired from a gun. Silence fell, a profound, absolute silence that was more shocking than the preceding chaos. The constant, wrong hum of the veil was gone. The ship floated, dead and powerless, in the calm, quiet, dark. On the bridge, the crew was frozen, their eyes wide, taking in the impossible sight on the view screen. It was a star field, but it was right. The light didn't bend. The constellations were sharp. Unfamiliar jewels scattered across perfect, tranquil black. This was prime reality. "Report," Kaylin managed to say, her throat tight. The spell was broken. The bridge crew burst into a flurry of activity, their voices overlapping with a mixture of shock and elation. "Breaker engine is offline. Completely fried," the engineer reported. "Main power is out. We're on emergency batteries, maybe 12 hours of life support. Hull breaches on decks 4 and 7, but containment fields are holding," Jen added, her fingers flying across her console. "We're bleeding atmosphere, but slowly." "And the good news?" Kaylin asked, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. Jian looked up, her face illuminated by the glow of her screen, and for the first time since the mission began, she grinned. "The beacon is intact, and the star charts. They match the archives. We're in the Kurgnus Arm, just where the simulations predicted. They had done it. They were back. They were the vanguard, the tip of the spear. Their mission was simple, and its success was paramount to everything that would follow. They were to deploy the Kronos beacon, a device that would anchor the temporal distortion of their entry point, stabilizing the tear they had made long enough for the Ascendancy's main fleets to follow them through. But the beacon required a colossal amount of energy to activate, far more than the dying ship possessed. They were adrift, a wounded wolf in an unknown forest, and they needed to find a meal. "Scan the system," Kaylin ordered. "Find me a power source, far from the bleeding." Wounded human ship. Inside a structure of such scale it dwarfed the local star it orbited. The entity known as Lyran Ka registered a flicker of data that was so unusual it was almost dismissed by the automated filters. Lyran Ka was an archivist of the Architect's Covenant, a member of the Cygnian species, a race of beings who had long ago shed their physical forms for bodies of woven light and intricate energy, allowing them to interface directly with the great archive of Ethelgard. Ethelgard was not a planet or a station, but a full Dyson sphere, the heart and mind of the Covenant. Here, the history of the galaxy, as curated by the architects, was stored. Lyran Ka's specialty was defunct civilizations and cosmic anomalies, a quiet and often boring field. He was reviewing stellar formation data from the outer rim when the alert came through. A patrol drone, a simple sensor platform, had registered a dimensional shearing event. The initial analysis tagged it as a micro-wormhole collapse, a rare but natural phenomenon. Most archivists would have cataloged it and moved on, but Lyran Ka was meticulous. He pulled the raw energy readings, letting the complex data flow through his consciousness. There was a spike of gravitic energy, impossibly high, followed by a wave of exotic particles he had only ever seen referenced in one other file, a file that was 700 years old, sealed under the highest authority of the Covenant Triumvirate. A cold, alien sensation and that approximated dread washed through him. The file was labeled Quarantine Event, Sector 001, Subject Humanity. He cross-referenced the energy signature from the patrol drone with the historical data. The patterns were not identical. The old signature was orders of magnitude larger, an ocean compared to a drop of water, but the underlying frequency, the gravitic resonance, was the same. It was like finding the fossilized footprint of a predator you had been assured was extinct for eons. He sent a priority query to the patrol drone. Observe and report. Do not engage. Transmit all sensor data on a continuous, dedicated stream. His superiors would call him paranoid. The quarantine was absolute. The physics of the veil were designed to be inescapable. Nothing had ever come out. Nothing ever could. It was a foundational truth of the Covenant's long, stable reign. And yet, the data did not lie. Something had just scratched the door. Aboard the Unmaking, the system scan resolved into a clear picture. It was a gas giant, a swirling behemoth of hydrogen and helium, orbited by a dozen small moons. And around one of those moons was a structure. It was an orbital refinery, vast and elegant, a filigree of silver and light against the darkness. It shimmered with power, siphoning exotic gases from the moon's atmosphere. It was Covenant. The design was unmistakable, graceful, organic curves that spoke of a civilization that viewed engineering as a form of art. It was also the power source they needed. "That's our target," Kaylin said, her voice flat and cold. "That refinery's core will be more than enough to power the beacon's activation sequence." Jian hesitated. "Breaker, we have no main weapons. The engine is down. All we have are the grav cutters and their short-range defensive systems. The grav cutters were a byproduct of the Breaker engine. Small, tactical projectors that could create localized gravity shears, capable of slicing through a ship's hull at close range. They weren't designed for a frontal assault." "We won't need a frontal assault," Kaylin replied, her eyes narrowing as she studied the refinery's layout. "They don't know we're here, and even if they did, they don't know what we are. To them, we are a ghost, an anomaly. They won't be expecting a wolf to have teeth." She outlined the plan. It was audacious, bordering on insane. They would use their last reserves of power for a short-range jump, putting them in the shadow of the refinery's moon. From there, they would approach on minimal power, using the moon's magnetic field to mask their signature. They would get close enough to use the cutters. It was a knife fight in the dark, and the Unmaking, for all its wounds, was still a predator. The Covenant patrol drone that Lyran Ka was monitoring watched as the anomaly it had detected vanished from its sensors. It had simply disappeared. The drone logged the event, its simple AI unable to comprehend the concept of a tactical dimensional jump. On the refinery, life proceeded with the calm, ordered tranquility that defined the Covenant. The automated systems hummed their ancient song, overseen by a small crew of Cygnian technicians who floated through the corridors like benign spirits. They registered the approach of the Unmaking a few minutes before the attack, but the ship's profile was so alien, its energy signature so bizarre, that they classified it as a rogue asteroid or a strange piece of stellar debris. They launched a small tender vessel to investigate, more out of curiosity than concern. That was their final mistake. The Unmaking emerged from the moon's shadow like a specter of death. Its hull was a nightmare of sharp angles and blackened, scorched armor plating, a stark contrast to the Covenant's smooth, flowing designs. It was a ship built for war, not for art. Before the tender could even hail them, the grav cutters fired. There was no flash of light, no energy beam, no projectile. Space itself simply twisted. The tender vessel was caught in a localized distortion field and was folded in on itself, crushed into a ball of super dense scrap in less than a second. On the refinery, alarms blared in confusion. The technicians had never witnessed such a weapon. As they struggled to understand what was happening, the Unmaking descended upon them. It didn't fire again. It used its cutters to carve. A blade of warped gravity, invisible and absolute, sliced through the refinery's primary struts. Support arms as thick as mountains were severed without a sound. The elegant structure, a marvel of engineering that had stood for 1,000 years, began to collapse, falling apart in slow, silent motion as its own internal pressures tore it to pieces. Kalen watched without emotion as the refinery died. This was not vengeance. Not yet. This was necessity. Her crew worked with brutal efficiency, launching a boarding pod that latched onto the refinery's exposed, dying core. Engineers in armored void suits stormed the chamber, overwhelming the few remaining dazed technicians, and began the process of siphoning its power. The destruction of the Kurgnus refinery sent a shockwave of disbelief through the Covenant's command structure. It was not the loss of the asset that was so shocking, it was the manner of its destruction. The data logs were incomprehensible. A vessel of unknown origin, wielding technology that violated known physical principles, had simply erased a state-of-the-art facility and then vanished back into the shadow of the moon. On Ethelgard, Lyran Ka felt the news like a physical blow. The energy signature from the weapon matched the anomaly. It was not a ghost. It was real, and it was hostile. He gathered his data, his findings, the terrifying conclusion that had been building in his consciousness, and demanded an audience with the Triumvirate. He found them in their sanctum, three beings of immense age and power, their forms shimmering like captive galaxies. They were the architects of the Covenant's millennia-long peace, the ones who had made the decision to quarantine humanity. There has been an incident in the Kurgnus arm, Lyran Ka began, his synthesized voice tight with urgency. A refinery destroyed, but the nature of the attack, the energy profiles, they match the residual traces of the quarantine event. The central figure, Triumvir Triarch Eris, shimmered with condescension. You persist with this fantasy. Archivist, the quarantine is absolute. It was our greatest work. A small piece of that work may have just come undone. Lyran Ka insisted. I believe the vessel that destroyed the refinery is human. A wave of something akin to amusement washed from the Triumvirate. Impossible, even if they survived, which is doubtful. They would be primitives, savages. They would not possess technology capable of such a thing. While they debated, on a barren, airless moon orbiting a gas giant in the Kurgnus arm, the Kronos beacon was planted, powered by the stolen heart of the refinery. It came to life. A low hum built into a piercing tone that resonated not in the air, but in the fabric of space-time itself. It fired a single smallest pulse of energy back towards the invisible tear in reality. A signal, a key turning in a lock. On the bridge of the Unmaking, Kalen watched the confirmation light blink green. The door was open. The way was clear. She looked at the star chart on her main screen, at the countless points of light that represented the galaxy that had cast her people out, the galaxy they now intended to reclaim. A cold, hard smile, the smile of a predator that has tasted first blood, touched her lips. Back in the triumvirate sanctum, Lyran Ka made his final plea. You underestimate them. You have always underestimated them. Their defining characteristic was not violence, but adaptation. You place them in a cage with different rules, and they have spent 700 years learning to master them. That isn't a ghost at our door. It is the consequence of our own arrogance, and it is coming to collect. Triarch Eris was about to dismiss him again when a new alert chimed through the sanctum. This one from the deep-range sensors that monitored the very fabric of the universe. An energy reading of unprecedented scale was emanating from the Kurgnus arm. The tear in reality, once a microscopic fracture, was being forced open. It was becoming a gateway. The triumvirate fell silent, the weight of the archivist's words finally crashing down upon them as they stared at the data feed, watching in dawning horror as the readings climbed, promising the arrival of a fleet forged in a different kind of hell. The storm had arrived. The gateway did not so much open as it bled into reality. From the vantage point of Ethelgard's deepest sensors, the triumvirate and a horrified Lyran Ka watched the wound in space-time widen. It was not a clean portal, not the elegant, shimmering doorways their own technology could create. This was a jagged, angry tear, leaking the wrong physics of the veil into their universe like septic fluid. And from that tear, the ships of the Sol Ascendancy began to emerge. They were not beautiful. They were a fleet of clenched fists and broken teeth, a naval force designed by a species that had forgotten the concepts of elegance and grace. Their hulls were not smooth, but faceted and angular, thick slabs of bruised, dark gray armor plating that seemed to absorb light. There were no gentle curves, only hard lines and menacing silhouettes. These were not vessels, they were weapons, pure and simple, and they bore the scars of their forging. Ethereal energy patterns, the residual stress of existing in the veil for centuries, still flickered across their armor like captive ghosts, a visible sign of the unnatural reality that had birthed them. The first through the gate was a line of destroyers, the Harbinger class, built like arrowheads with a massive spinal cannon running their entire length. They moved with a predatory swiftness, establishing a perimeter around the gateway. Then came the cruisers, behemoths of layered armor and weapons batteries, ships with names like Ironclad and Implacable. And finally, the carriers, vast, blocky ships called World Breakers, from whose cavernous launch bays swarmed thousands of smaller strike craft, fighters and bombers that moved not like graceful birds, but like angry, stinging insects. On Ethelgard, the sanctum was frozen in a horrified silence. The scale of the fleet was staggering. This was no mere scouting party. This was an invasion. How Triarch Eris whispered, his form of woven light flickering with disturbance. How could they have built such a thing in that wasteland? Lyran Ka felt a cold, vindicated despair. We gave them nothing but scrap and a hostile reality. He transmitted, his voice flat, so they learned to build with scrap. We gave them a universe that tried to kill them, so they built ships that could kill a universe. The second triumvir, Triarch Hesh, whose form was a vortex of deep violet, finally stirred. This display is meaningless. They are primitives. Their designs are brutish. They have no shields, no energy projection of note. The first defense fleet will dismantle them. He turned to Eris. Give the order. Scour them from our space. Let this be the final, forgotten footnote in the history of humanity. Eris hesitated for only a fraction of a second, then gave the command. Across the sector, the Covenant's 1st Defense Fleet responded. Grand Admiral Vorlog received the order on the bridge of his flagship, the Celestial Aegis. The Aegis was the pinnacle of Covenant design, a vessel shaped like a magnificent stylized bird of prey. Its hull a seamless alloy of pearlescent white and gold that shimmered with contained energy. His fleet consisted of 100 such vessels, each one a masterpiece of art and engineering, armed with lances of pure particle energy that could slice an asteroid in half from a light minute away. Vorlog studied the first sensor images of the human fleet, and a flicker of contempt passed through him. They were ugly, asymmetrical. They looked less like starships and more like repurposed mining equipment. He could see no visible shield emitters, no sign of the sophisticated energy work that defined Covenant naval power. This would be a simple, if distasteful, extermination. "All ships," he commanded, his voice resonating with the calm authority of a commander who had never known true defeat. "Assume the Sunstorm formation. We will greet these refugees with the light of the Covenant. Target their lead vessels. Show them the folly of their return. In the shadow of the Kurgnus moon." Kaelin Valerius watched the same invasion fleet fill her view screen. The sight of the Ascendancy's full might, a power she had only ever seen in simulations, filled her with a fierce, cold pride. The UNS Vengeance, the Fleet Marshal's command ship, moved to the fore. It was a vessel of terrifying scale, a fortress city of a ship, its hull blacker than the void and bristling with weapons that Kaelin knew were capable of cracking continents. A secure channel opened. The face of Fleet Marshal Thorne appeared on her screen. He was a man who looked as though he were carved from granite, his face a road map of scars and his eyes the color of a winter sky. He was the embodiment of the Ascendancy's will. "Breaker Valerius," he said, his voice a low gravel. "Your report was concise. The Chronos beacon is stable. You have performed your duty. There was no praise, no warmth. None was expected. The Covenant's 1st Defense Fleet is inbound." Kaelin replied, transmitting her ship's sensor logs. 100 ships, standard cruiser and destroyer classes, energy-based weaponry. Estimated arrival in 20 minutes. Thorne nodded, his gaze already looking past her, towards the coming battle. "We are aware. Your mission is complete. The unmaking is to fall back to the gateway's edge and provide sensor support. Do not engage. You have bled enough for one day." The channel closed. Kaelin watched as the human fleet formed up, not in an elegant, geometric pattern like the Covenant, but in a brutalist wall of armored ships. A layered, interlocking shield of metal and guns. They did not wait for the enemy to come to them. With a coordinated burn of their veil-forged engines, which left shimmering, momentary distortions in space behind them, the entire fleet surged forward to meet the enemy head-on. The two fleets met in the void between worlds. The Covenant ships, gleaming and perfect, opened fire first. Beams of brilliant, blinding light, lances of pure energy, crossed the distance in an instant. They struck the lead Ascendancy cruisers with devastating force. Explosions of superheated gas and molten metal erupted from their hulls. To Grand Admiral Vorlog, it looked like a successful first strike. His weapons were performing exactly as they should. His officers reported direct hits, significant damage. He allowed himself a moment of satisfaction, but the human ships did not break. They did not shatter. They shuddered, their armor glowing cherry red where the beams had struck. Entire sections vaporized, but they kept coming. Their internal structures, built to withstand the constant warping stress of the veil, were compartmentalized and massively reinforced. They were designed to take absurd amounts of punishment, to have entire sections blown away and still remain functional. Vorlog's satisfaction curdled into confusion. His lances were designed to pierce shields and gut a vessel in a single shot, but these ships had no shields to pierce. Their defense was simply brute force endurance, a concept so primitive he had not factored it into his calculations. Then, the Soul Ascendancy returned fire. There were no beams of light. Instead, the forward sections of the human ships opened up, and a wave of projectiles was launched at incredible velocity. But these were not simple slugs of metal. As they approached the Covenant fleet, the warheads detonated, not in explosions of fire, but in bursts of gravitational distortion. A cruiser on Vorlog's flank, the Shining Blade, was struck by 3 of these warheads. Its sophisticated energy shields flickered, designed to deflect energy and plasma, not to fight the very fabric of space, and the gravitic pulses passed right through them, and the ship's beautiful, bird-like hull suddenly buckled, twisted, and then folded in on itself, crushed into a screaming, misshapen ball of metal by its own localized singularity. Before the Covenant crews could even process this horror, the main guns of the Ascendancy's battleships opened up. They fired massive, city block-sized projectiles encased in a shimmering field of distorted spacetime. These were not meant to pierce, they were meant to shatter. One of these rounds struck the Celestial Aegis's sister ship, the Radiant Shield. Didn't explode on impact. It passed through the vessel's energy shields as if they weren't there and plowed through dozens of decks before its temporal field collapsed. The resulting backlash of raw kinetic energy released inside the ship, tore it apart from the inside out. One moment it was a pristine warship, the next it was an expanding cloud of incandescent shrapnel. Panic, a sensation unknown on a Covenant bridge for centuries, began to ripple through Vorlog's crew. "What are these weapons?" his tactical officer cried out, his voice shaking. "Our shields have no effect. They're bypassing our primary defenses." Vorlog stared, his mind struggling to comprehend the tactical reality. His fleet was built for a fencing match, and his enemy had shown up with sledgehammers and crowbars. His elegant formations were now a liability, his ships too close together, making them easy targets for the area of effect gravitic weapons. He saw a squadron of human bombers swarm a Covenant destroyer. They didn't use lasers or missiles. They fired what looked like anchors, which latched onto the ship's hull. Then, the anchors engaged, generating a counter-resonant gravitic frequency. The destroyer's hull began to vibrate, then tear itself apart as conflicting gravitational forces ripped it to pieces. It was brutal. It was savage. It was horrifyingly effective. The battle, if it could be called that, was over in less than 10 minutes. Of Grand Admiral Vorlog's 100 pristine warships, more than 70 were shattered ruins, drifting hulks, or expanding clouds of vaporized alloy. The remaining ships were in full, panicked retreat, fleeing back towards the core worlds. The Ascendancy fleet had lost 5 cruisers and a dozen destroyers, with many more heavily damaged, but their wall of iron remained intact, pushing relentlessly forward. On the bridge of the crippled Celestial Aegis, alarms blared a symphony of death. Half the ship was open to the void. Vorlog stood gripping a console, his body rigid with shock. He was watching the sensory play of his fleet's annihilation, watching these brutish, ugly ships dismantle a force that had been the guardian of galactic peace for 1,000 years. He finally understood. This was not a primitive race lashing out. This was a civilization that had been raised in a cage where the fundamental laws of the universe were a weapon to be used against them. They hadn't just survived. They had adapted. They had weaponized their prison. The ghost had not just returned with teeth, it had returned as a pack of wolves, and their long, tranquil hunt was over. Vorlog looked at the advancing human fleet, at the scarred, pitiless iron ships that had just erased his own, and he felt the first, true taste of fear. It tasted like extinction. And in the sanctum on Ethelgard, the triumvirate watched in stunned silence as the red icons representing their first defense fleet vanished one by one from the galactic map. Lyran Ka did not say a word. He didn't have to. The silence screamed louder than any "I told you so" ever could. The Age of the Covenant had just ended. The Age of Humanity had begun in fire and warped space. The news of the First Fleet's annihilation at the Kurgnus Gate did not spread across the Covenant. It detonated. For a civilization built on the bedrock of unshakable stability and technological supremacy, the concept of such a one-sided defeat was not just shocking, it was reality-shattering. On 100 worlds, from the crystalline spires of Signia Prime to the tranquil voting academies of Xylos, the initial reports were dismissed as errors, as human propaganda, as some form of impossible censor ghost. But the truth was a contagion of fear that could not be contained. Wreckage, once gleaming and proud, now twisted into grotesque sculptures of ruin, began to drift back into the core systems. Escape pods, carrying dazed and traumatized survivors, brought with them tales of impossible weapons and a foe that fought with the cold. Brutal efficiency of a natural disaster. The Covenant's long, serene dream was over, replaced by a waking nightmare. On Ethelgard, the triumvirate was in seclusion, their sanctum sealed as they debated a response. The defeat had exposed a fundamental flaw in their philosophy. They had built a society that was a perfect, intricate clockwork, but they had forgotten how to deal with a hammer. Triarch Hesh, the advocate for swift military action, was now silent, his violet energy form muted and turbulent. It was Triarch Eris who finally broke the stasis, his voice resonating with a gravity that bordered on despair. "We were wrong. The archivist was right. We did not cage an animal. We created a monster, the third triumvir, a being of ancient, silent gold named Zareen, who had not spoken in a century, now stirred. Monsters can be understood," she transmitted, her thoughts like the slow, inexorable grinding of tectonic plates. "This is a force of nature, a consequence. What is our response to a supernova, to a black hole? We do not fight it. We endure it. Or we redirect it." Eris's form flared with agitation. "Redirect it. They are tearing through the Outer Rim colonies as we speak. They are not conquering, Zareen. They are harvesting, stripping worlds of resources, dismantling our orbital platforms, feeding their war machine. They fight with a desperate hunger we cannot comprehend." He was right. The Ascendancy fleet was not behaving like a traditional conqueror. They were locusts, descending upon the resource-rich but lightly defended outer territories of the Covenant. They ignored planets with large populations, focusing instead on automated mining colonies, fuel depots, and industrial fabricators. Fleet Marshal Thorne's strategy was brutally pragmatic. The Ascendancy had arrived with the ships and the will to fight, but their long exile had left them resource-starved. Their Veil-forged technology was powerful but materially expensive and difficult to maintain in prime reality. This was not a war of subjugation, it was a war of logistics. They were seizing the means to continue the fight, building a supply chain from the bones of their enemy's empire. On the bridge of the UNS Vengeance, Thorne presided over this vast, galactic-scale pillaging with an iron calm. Before him, A holographic map showed their progress, a creeping tide of ascendancy control spreading through the Covenant's periphery. The Unmaking, now repaired and rearmed with scavenged Covenant energy conduits that had been brutally retrofitted to its own systems, served as a fast response scout, Kylan and her crew charting paths for the main fleet. The colony on Xylos 7 has fallen. Jian Li reported to Kaylin, her voice tight. They were in orbit over the now silent world, watching as massive ascendancy cargo haulers stripped its automated factories bare. The local militia didn't stand a chance. Kaylin watched the data feed, a flicker of something uncomfortable twisting in her gut. The Xylans were a gentle, scholarly race, known for their art and philosophy. Their militia had been little more than armed constables. The Ascendancy's ground troops, the Black Guard, HFY, had swept through the Mahi in less than an hour. The official report called it pacification. Kaylin knew it was a massacre. This was the part of the war they didn't show in the patriotic simulacra back in the Veil. This was the ugly yet necessary math of their survival. Our orders are to secure resources, Kaylin said, her voice harder than she intended. Xylos 7 is now a secure resource. Log the report and chart a course for the Kepler depot. Fleet Command wants its Prometheum reserves. Jian looked at her, a question in her eyes. Jian was younger, born in the last decades of the exile. She had been raised on tales of glorious return, of righteous vengeance against the decadent Covenant. She was seeing the reality of that return for the first time, and it was not glorious. It was grimy and brutal. Breaker, Jian said, her voice low. The Xylans, they surrendered. The Black Guard didn't. They didn't take prisoners. Kaylin turned away from the view screen, unable to watch the mechanical arms of the cargo haulers dismantling a city of art. The Fleet Marshal's doctrine is clear. Jian, the Covenant is not a collection of species. It is a single entity, an idea. And you cannot take an idea prisoner. You can only destroy its ability to exist. Now, set the course. The simmering discontent was not confined to Kaylin's ship. Throughout the fleet, the human crews, forged in the hardship and unity of the Veil, were now confronted with the vast, diverse tapestry of the galaxy they had been taught to hate. They found worlds of breathtaking beauty, inhabited by species that were not arrogant gods, but simple farmers, artists, and traders. They saw the fear in the multifaceted eyes of insectoid merchants and heard the weeping of amphibious poets as their homes were repurposed into military barracks. The righteous fire of their crusade was being tempered by a confusing, unwelcome douse of reality. The Covenant was not a monolith. It was a civilization, filled with innocents who had no part in the decision made 700 years ago. This realization began to plant seeds of doubt, a quiet but persistent question that whispered through the mess halls and engine rooms. Are we the heroes of the story, or are we the villains? Fleet Marshal Thorne was not blind to this sentiment. He was a student of history, and he knew that the greatest threat to a conquering army was never the enemy in front of them, but the moral decay within them. He needed a target. He needed to remind his people of who the enemy truly was. He needed to show them the heart of the Covenant's perceived arrogance, to give them a symbol to hate, a fortress to smash. He chose Ethelgard. The decision was met with shock by his own command council. Ethelgard, the Dyson Sphere, was the political, cultural, and military core of the Covenant. It was a fortress of unimaginable scale, protected by the Grand Fleet, a force 10 times the size of the annihilated First Fleet, and defended by weapon systems integrated into the sphere itself, capable of sterilizing entire star systems. A direct assault was considered suicidal. "It is not an assault," Thorne explained, his voice cutting through the objections in the war room. "It is a statement. The Covenant believes we are barbarians, scavenging at their edges. They are regrouping, studying our tactics. They will adapt. We must strike now, before they can build weapons to counter our own. We will not conquer Ethelgard. We will break it. We will crack their holy temple and show the galaxy that their gods can bleed." His plan was as brutal and direct as the man himself. He would take the core of his fleet, the most powerful battleships and the new world-breaker carriers, and make a direct run at the Dyson Sphere. They would use the breaker technology not to open a gateway, but as a weapon of unimaginable destruction. They would weaponize a dimensional tear. A ship, a modified world-breaker carrier designated the Ragnarok, had been stripped of its crew and packed with a series of chained, overloaded breaker engines. It was no longer a ship. It was a bomb capable of tearing a hole in reality itself. The plan was to jump it into close proximity of Ethelgard and detonate it. The resulting dimensional shear would, in theory, be enough to shatter a significant portion of the Dyson Sphere's structure. It was a weapon that would make the gravitic warheads look like firecrackers. Back on Ethelgard, Liren Ka had reached a similar, terrifying conclusion. He had spent weeks in the deepest archives, running simulations, analyzing the energy signatures of the human weapons. He had pieced together the principles of their Veil-forged technology. He understood the breaker engine, and he realized that its potential as a weapon was far greater than anything they had yet witnessed. He brought his findings to the Triumvirate. "They are not just coming to fight," he warned. "They are coming to unmake this place. Their technology allows them to manipulate the fabric of reality. They can create a localized event that would be indistinguishable from the end of a universe. We cannot stop it with ships or energy lances." Triarch Zarene's golden form shimmered. "What do you propose?" Archivist Surrender Numba. Liren Ka replied, "I propose we understand. The foundation of this conflict is a 700-year-old crime. We judged them. We exiled them. And in their prison, they became the very thing we feared. Perhaps the only way to end this is not with a greater weapon, but with a greater truth." Eris dismissed him with a wave of energy. "Philosophy will not stop their fleet, and the Grand Fleet is mobilizing. Ethelgard will not fall." But Liren Ka saw the fear behind the bravado. They were preparing for a battle of ships and guns, while the enemy was preparing to rewrite the laws of physics on their doorstep. As the Ascendancy fleet prepared for its desperate, all-or-nothing charge, Kalen Valerius received a new set of orders. The unmaking was to be part of the Vanguard, a scout that would clear the path for the Ragnarok. Her job was to identify and eliminate any long-range sensor platforms that could give the Covenant an early warning. It was a suicide mission, a flight into the heart of the enemy's power. Before they departed, Jian approached her on the bridge. "Breaker," she said, her face pale but determined. "The crew, they know what this mission is. They're scared, but they'll follow you. I need to know. Do you believe this is right, cracking their homeworld, killing billions?" Kalen looked out at the starfield, at the distant, impossibly bright star that was Ethelgard. For 700 years, her people had stared out at the swirling chaos of the Veil and dreamt of this. Vengeance, retribution. But now that it was here, it felt hollow, heavy. "Right," she said, her voice a low murmur. "I don't know what's right anymore. Jian, I only know what's necessary. We were caged. Now, we are the ones who will rattle the bars. Whether that makes us heroes or monsters, I suspect history will be written by whoever is left standing." She turned to her first officer, her eyes filled with a grim, weary resolve. "Prepare the ship for a tactical jump. We have a date with an angry god." And as the Unmaking vanished into the distorted non-space of a jump, on Ethelgard, Lyran Ka, defying the Triumvirate, opened a forbidden archive. It contained the complete, uncensored history of humanity, their art, their music, their philosophies, their capacity for both great love and great cruelty. It was the data the Covenant had deemed too dangerous, too chaotic. He was looking for a weakness, but not in their ships or their weapons. He was looking for a weakness in their soul. He was looking for a reason. He had to believe that a species capable of creating such things could still be reached, that the monster was not all they had become. He was looking for a ghost. Not the ghost of a dead species, but the ghost of who they used to be. And he was running out of time. The assault on Ethelgard began not with the roar of engines, but with a calculated, surgical silence. Kalen Valerius piloted the Unmaking through the outer defenses of the Covenant's core system, her ship a ghost in a sea of overwhelming force. The space around the Dyson Sphere was a minefield of sensor webs, automated weapons platforms, and patrol fleets that moved with the precision of a celestial dance. Kalen's ship, however, was not moving through their reality, using a series of micro-jumps, a technique that was akin to skipping a stone across the surface of space-time. The Unmaking flickered in and out of existence, bypassing sensor grids by simply not existing within their detection windows. The stress on the hull was immense, the ship groaning as if it were being torn apart and reassembled with every jump. But the crew, honed by the suicidal charge that had brought them here, operated with a cold, focused precision. Their targets were the Covenant's primary FTL comm nodes, the relays that allowed the Grand Fleet to coordinate its defense across the sphere's entire massive surface. They would blind the god before they stabbed it in the eye. On the bridge, the tension was a physical weight. "First node approaching," Jian Li reported, her voice a strained whisper, as if a loud sound could betray them. "It's shielded, heavily. Quantum entanglement comms. They'll know the instant it's down." "They won't have time to report it," Kalen said, her hands dancing across her own console, priming the grav cutters. "Get me a firing solution. We don't need to be subtle anymore. We just need to be fast." The Unmaking dropped out of its micro-jump barely 50 kilometers from the comm node, a station the size of a small city, before its automated defenses could even register the alien vessel signature. Kalen fired. The grav cutters, supercharged by the scavenged Covenant tech, lashed out. The invisible blade of warped gravity didn't just slice the station, it shattered it, twisting its internal structure into a pretzel of metal and light before the quantum shields could even fully modulate. Alarms blared across the Covenant defense grid, but it was already too late. As defense squadrons scrambled toward the vector of the attack, Kalen was already jumping, her target the second node on the sphere's opposite pole. She was a hornet, stinging and moving before the giant could even register the pain. While Kalen caused chaos, Fleet Marshal Thorne's main fleet arrived. They didn't emerge at the system's edge. They tore a new, massive gateway open just outside the sphere's optimal firing range, a colossal, bleeding wound in reality. The Grand Fleet, under the command of a new, grimly determined Grand Admiral named Koro, was caught flat-footed. They had expected an attack from the periphery, not an enemy that could simply open a door in their own throne room. The battle was joined instantly. It was not a repeat of Kurgnus. The Covenant had learned. They kept their distance, using their superior range and numbers to create a wall of particle lances and plasma torpedoes. They sacrificed their own screening ships to intercept the Ascendancy's gravitic projectiles, learning to counter the spatial warping weapons by detonating their own ship's cores, creating energy buffers that neutralized the distortion fields. It was a brutal, costly meat grinder of a battle. Human ships, their thick armor vaporized by sustained, overwhelming energy fire, were turned into drifting coffins. Covenant vessels, caught by the swarming, vicious bombers or the unpredictable grav guns, shattered into frozen debris. But Thorn wasn't trying to win this battle. He was just creating a distraction. "The path is clear. Marshal." Kaylin's voice crackled across the Vengeance's bridge, her ship having just destroyed the final comm node. "They're deaf and fighting blind. The corridor is open." "Proceed," Thorn commanded, his single word sealing the fate of billions. From the center of the Ascendancy formation, the Ragnarok began its run. It was a skeletal, stripped-down world-breaker, its engines glowing with a sickly, unnatural light. It was protected by the Black Guard's elite squadron, flying ships painted in the matte black of the void. They punched a hole through the chaotic battle, sacrificing themselves to clear a path. Their ships little more than armored battering rams for the dimensional bomb they escorted. On Ethelgard, the Triumvirate watched the tactical display in horror. Their fleet was in disarray, their communications severed, and now this single, massive, unidentified vessel was accelerating toward the sphere, ignoring every other ship on the battlefield. "It's the weapon," Triarch Eris breathed, his light form flickering violently. "The one Lyran Ka warned us about. They are going to unmake us all." At that moment, Lyran Ka was not in the sanctum. He was deep in the bowels of Ethelgard, in a forbidden broadcast center. He had spent the last several days not in military archives, but in the forbidden data, the human cultural files. He had found what he was looking for, not a weapon, not a weakness. He had found their humanity. He had isolated a series of files, recordings of music, compositions of breathtaking sorrow and defiant joy, philosophical texts debating morality and sacrifice, sensor recordings from ancient Earth of parents shielding their children from harm, poems about love and loss. It was the chaotic, contradictory, beautiful soul of a species he had been taught was only a plague. Now, as the Ragnarok accelerated toward its sacrificial destination, Lyran Ka began his broadcast. He didn't send it to the Triumvirate. He hijacked every available frequency and broadcast it directly at the Ascendancy fleet. He sent it on all channels, open and encrypted, piggybacking on their own communication systems, which Kaylin's attack had inadvertently left vulnerable to internal intrusion. On the bridge of the Unmaking, Kaylin was plotting a jump back to the fleet when her comms erupted. It wasn't static, it was music, a wave of complex harmonies, a chorus of human voices singing in a language she barely recognized but understood on a primal level. It was a sound of such profound, agonizing beauty that it stopped her breath. Then came the images. Flickering across her auxiliary screens, a man and a woman embracing as their world burned, a philosopher calmly accepting a cup of poison, defiant in his ideals, mathematical equations blooming into fractal art, the sound of laughter. On the Vengeance, Thorn slammed his fist on his console. "What is this? Get this filth off my screens!" But the signal was everywhere. In the engine rooms, mechanics paused, their hands frozen on their tools, listening to a symphony that spoke of a home they had never known. In the bomber cockpits, pilots watched holographic images of children playing in fields of green under a yellow sun, a sight so alien it was fantastical. The data stream was relentless, a flood of their own lost history, their own stolen culture, weaponized against them. And then came Lyran Ka's voice. It was not synthesized or alien. He used their own linguistic protocols, his voice calm and clear over the sound of the cascading cultural data. "We hear you," he said, the words echoing across the fleet. "You were wronged. We committed a crime of arrogance and fear. What was done to you was an abomination. But look at what you're about to do." The data stream shifted. Now it showed the interior of Ethelgard, not the military sanctum, but the world within the sphere. Vast, sculpted continents floating in an ocean of breathable air. Cities of light inhabited by trillions of beings, Signian, Xylan, and a dozen other species. Families moving through parks, children in learning centers, ancient beings meditating in temples of light, civilians, innocent. "This is not a fortress." Lyran Ka's voice continued, resonating with a desperate, pleading sincerity. "It is a world. It is a home. You have returned from your darkness, but you have brought the darkness with you. Is this your justice to answer one atrocity with an even greater one? On the bridge of the Ragnarok, the automated systems were moments from their final detonation sequence, but the ship was not entirely automated. A 3-person volunteer crew, a fail-safe team, was there to ensure the device could not be stopped. Its commander, a grim veteran named Salin, stared at his screen. It was showing a recording of his own great-grandfather, one of the first generation born in the Vale, holding his newborn son and weeping, whispering a promise that humanity would one day see the true stars again, not as conquerors Vitol, but as people. Salin was shaking. This was the dream he was fighting for, not the nightmare he was about to create. On the Vengeance. Fleet Marshal Thorn watched his tactical display. The Ragnarok was seconds from its target. "Commander Salin, confirm detonation," he roared. There was silence. Then Salin's voice came back, strained and broken. "Negative, Marshal. We can't. We will not be the monsters they thought we were." "That is treason," Thorn bellowed. "We will be." Before Thorn could give another order, the Ragnarok's engines flared, but they didn't accelerate toward the sphere. They turned, angling away, climbing up on a sharp vector. The Covenant Grand Fleet, seeing the dimensional bomb break off its attack run, assumed it was a feint and began to converge on it, unleashing a torrent of energy fire. Selen was taking his ship directly into the heart of the enemy fleet. "What are you doing, Commander?" Thorn whispered, his face ashen, realizing the betrayal. "We are finishing the mission, Marshal." Salin replied, his voice calm now, resigned. He was surrounded by exploding Covenant ships, his own vessel breaking apart under the barrage. "You said we needed to break them, but this broadcast, we are breaking ourselves. The mission is not vengeance. It's to survive, and survival means being worthy of it." The Ragnarok's core went critical. Salin initiated the detonation manually, but he was not next to Ethelgard. He was in the middle of the Covenant Grand Fleet. A silent flash of non-light erupted in the void. Reality tore. Space-time itself screamed. Tst. A localized, weaponized dimensional shear ripped through the concentrated mass of the Covenant fleet. It was not an explosion. It was an erasure. Hundreds of Covenant capital ships, caught in the breaker detonation, were simply unmade, their structures torn apart at a subatomic level, their energy signatures vanishing as if they had never existed. When the blinding distortion cleared, a vast emptiness had been torn in the Covenant fleet. More than half the Grand Fleet was gone, but Ethelgard was untouched. It was a victory, but it was not the one Thorn had wanted. He had not broken their home. He had simply crippled their navy, at the cost of his ultimate weapon and a crew that had defied him. The human fleet, stunned, battle-scarred, and now deeply, profoundly conflicted, faltered. Across the comms, the human music and Lyran Ka's voice were gone, replaced only by the static of the void and the cries of their own wounded. Kaelin Valeria sat frozen on her bridge, her ship drifting in the aftermath. She had watched Saelin's sacrifice traits, had heard his final words. She looked at Jiangxi, whose face was streaked with tears. The war was not over, but it had just changed forever. The Ascendancy had proven it could bleed the Covenant, but the Covenant had just proven it could reach their soul. And in the Sanctum, a shaken Triarch Eris turned to Lyran Ka, who had just returned. "You have doomed us," Eris accused. "You stopped them from destroying the fleet entirely. You showed them mercy." "Oh," Lyran Ka replied, his own energy form steady. "I have not doomed us. I have given us a chance. For the first time in 700 years, they are no longer a monolith. They are human again. And now, finally, the war can truly begin." The aftermath of the Battle of Ethelgard was a universe holding its breath. The Ascendancy fleet, fractured not by enemy fire but by a crisis of conscience, had withdrawn from the core system. They limped back to their captured territories in the Outer Rim, their chain of command shattered. Fleet Marshal Thorn, a man whose entire existence was predicated on the unyielding, monolithic will of his people, found himself facing a rebellion not of arms, but of spirit. Commander Saelin's final act had not been one of treason. It had become a martyr's sacrifice. His last words spreading through the fleet like a viral creed. Survival means being worthy of it. Thorn had lost his ultimate weapon, a significant portion of his Black Guard escort, and, most critically, the absolute moral certainty that had fueled his crusade. He retreated not to regroup for another attack, but to quarantine his own forces from the philosophical plague Lyran Ka had unleashed. On the other side, Ori, the Covenant was equally shattered. They had survived, but their shield was broken. The Grand Fleet was a ghost of its former self, its commanders reeling from the sheer destructive power of the Ragnarok's detonation. Ethelgard stood, but the myth of its invincibility was dead. The Triumvirate was in turmoil. Triarch Hesh and his militaristic faction called for a war of total attrition, demanding the immediate development of their own dimensional weapons to answer the human threat in kind. But Triarch Zareen and a growing number of others saw the truth in Lyran Ka's actions. The archivist had not won a battle. He had opened a door to a different kind of war, a war of ideas. The stalemate was tense and fragile. Both civilizations, like two mortally wounded behemoths, paused to lick their wounds, eyeing each other across the expanse of a galaxy that was now a chessboard. It was Kaelin Valerius who made the first move. Haunted by Saelin's sacrifice and Lyran Ka's broadcast, she could no longer reconcile the brutal necessities of Thorn's war with the echoes of the humanity she had glimpsed in the Forbidden Archives. Her ship, the Unmaking, had become a symbol of the Ascendancy's fury, the first to break the veil, the first to draw Covenant blood. Now, she would make it a symbol of something new, defying Thorn's direct orders to stand down. She took the Unmaking and a handful of loyal crew on a covert mission. She did not jump toward Covenant space. She jumped into the unknown, to a small, uncharted nebula she had noted on her long-range scans. "What are we doing here?" Breaker Jian asked as the Unmaking drifted silently amidst clouds of incandescent gas. "Thorn has declared us traitors. The fleet is hunting us. The fleet is tearing itself apart," Kaelin countered, her gaze fixed on the nebula's swirling heart. "Thorn thinks this war is about metal and guns. Saelin and that archivist proved it's about something else. We need to stop fighting their war and start fighting ours. She had brought them to this nebula for a reason. During her attacks on the comm nodes, she had intercepted fragmented, deeply encrypted data that was not Covenant and not human. It spoke of a silent witness, an entity or location that predated the Covenant, a place of immense cosmic importance. The data pointed here. Using the Unmaking's unique Veil-forged sensors, they navigated the nebula, eventually finding what the data hinted at: a structure of impossible scale, ancient and dark, built not of metal, but of a crystalline substance that did not reflect light. It was a massive, silent archive, a library of a civilization long dead. This was the source of Lyran Ka's knowledge, the place where the true, uncensored history of the galaxy was kept. This was where the Covenant had learned of humanity in the first place, and where they had decided to bury the truth. While Kalen sought knowledge, Lyran Ka sought a similar path. He was now an outcast, censured by the Triumvirate but revered by a growing faction who saw him as the only one with a true understanding of their enemy. He used his newfound influence to access Ethelgard's most guarded secret, the personal logs of the Triumvirate from 700 years ago. There, he found the unvarnished truth. The decision to quarantine humanity had not been a unanimous act of galactic preservation. It had been a contentious, fear-driven power play. The record showed a thriving human civilization, expanding, yes, but also creating alliances, sharing technology base, and then challenging the stagnant, rigid order the Covenant had imposed for millennia. Humanity hadn't been a plague. They had been competition. The quarantine was not an act of mercy. It was an act of genocide born from jealousy. This truth for with us, he realized, was a weapon more powerful than any dimensional bomb. He broadcast it, not to the humans, but to the 100 worlds of the Covenant itself. He laid bare the lie at the heart of their civilization, revealing that their long peace was built on a foundation of cosmic crime. The revelation shattered the Covenant from within. Worlds began to secede. The military fractured, with many refusing to fight a war they now saw as unjust. The Triumvirate's authority crumbled into dust. The civil war Thorn had inadvertently started within his own fleet was now mirrored, on a galactic scale, within his enemy. Into this chaos, Kalen Valerius returned. She broadcast from the bridge of the Unmaking, positioned in neutral space between the two crumbling empires. But she did not broadcast threats or demands. She broadcast the knowledge she had found in the silent archive. The records of this galaxy did not begin with the Covenant, she announced. Her voice carried on all frequencies. They ruled for millennia, but they were not the first, nor were we. The civilization that built the archive at the heart of the Cinder Nebula, they were the true architects, and their final record is a warning. She displayed the archive's data. It showed a cycle, repeated over millions of years. A dominant species rises, imposes order, grows arrogant, and is eventually consumed by a threat from outside the galaxy, a recurring, predatory force that harvested advanced civilizations. The Covenant's predecessors had been one of its victims. The Covenant themselves were simply the next ripe fruit on the tree. The Covenant didn't cage us out of fear of what we would do to them. Kalen's voice resonated with the weight of this new, terrifying truth. They caged us out of fear of who we would become: a true rival, a civilization powerful enough to attract the attention of the real wolves waiting in the dark. They didn't save the galaxy from us. They doomed it by weakening it, by removing its most adaptive, unpredictable defenders right before the storm. Her broadcast was a cold shock of reality to both sides. To the remnants of the Covenant, it reframed their history not as one of noble stewardship, but of cowardly, self-serving folly. To the fractured ascendancy, it gave them a new enemy, a purpose beyond simple vengeance. Fleet Marshal Thorne, his authority broken, watched Kalen's broadcast from the bridge of his flagship. The war he had started was over, replaced by a truth so vast it rendered his hatred petty and small. In a final, desperate act to preserve his vision of humanity, he took his loyalist faction and plunged back through the Sergonus Gate, choosing to return to the Vale, to the predictable certainty of their cage, rather than face the complex, terrifying future Kalen had revealed. His departure was not a defeat, but a schism. A portion of humanity chose to remain caged. The rest, now led by Kalen Valerius, were free. The end did not come with a final, glorious battle. It came with a quiet, unprecedented meeting in the ruins of the Kurgnus system. Kalen Valerius, aboard the Unmaking, met with a delegation led by the archivist Lyran Ka, who now spoke for a new, humbled coalition of worlds rising from the ashes of the Covenant. They were no longer enemies. They were survivors. They stood before a common, existential threat that dwarfed their long and bloody conflict. "You have your galaxy back," Lyran Ka transmitted, his form of light shimmering with a weary respect. "What will you do with it?" Kalen looked from the alien archivist to the faces of her own crew, a crew that had been forged in darkness and had chosen the light. She thought of Salen's sacrifice, of the long, painful road from exile to understanding. "We will not rule it," she replied, her voice steady and clear, a promise echoing out into a universe that was finally, terribly, their own. "We will defend it." The war was over. A new one. A struggle for the survival of all life against the encroaching darkness was about to begin. Humanity had returned from the void, not as conquerors, not as monsters, but as what they had always been: flawed, chaotic, and unpredictable. But now, finally, ready to be guardians. The universe had been wrong about them, and in that error, it had found its last, best hope.